All right, I think we're ready to get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone watching online, both here in Brazil and from Washington and around the world. And thank you for those who are with us here in Rio. And welcome to our special event during the G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting, Shaping the Global Economy from Food Security to Digital Transformation. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center. And on behalf of the Geoeconomics Center, the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, and the entire Atlantic Council, thank you for being with us. And I want to thank our partners in this endeavor, AmCham Brazil, the B20, and SEBRI. We could not have done it without each of them, and we are very grateful for their partnership. Now, I wanted to take a moment just at the outset here, before we begin, to explain why the G20 is so critical. A lot of us who work in this space take it as a given, and I think it's important to take this moment here where the finance ministers and central bank governors of the world's largest economy are gathered to think about why it matters and why we are proud at the Atlantic Council to be a member of the T20, the Think Tank 20, which helps produce critical new thinking ahead of the Leaders Summit coming in November here in Rio. The G20 accounts for over 80% of global GDP, and over 75% of global trade, and comprises 60% of the world's population. The decisions made in these rooms with these ministers impact every person on the planet. I'm a believer that if the G20 didn't exist, we would have to probably invent something like it. And so it's worth thinking about the history of this body just for a moment. It began as a meeting only of the finance ministers, created in the late 1990s, to help avoid another wave of financial meltdowns like the Asian financial crisis and the Mexican peso crisis. It reflected a recognition from the US and Europe that the global economy was changing and more voices had to be present in key decision making. Think about the creativity and foresight of that decision. In 2008, as the global financial crisis started to develop, the world didn't need to create an institution to coordinate a response. It already had one. The G20. For the first time, leaders of G20 countries gathered during an emergency summit in Washington to develop a plan to rescue the global economy. Their work led to the so-called London moment less than 5 months later, where the G20 committed over $5 trillion in coordinated fiscal stimulus, something that at that time was unprecedented. It was economic multilateralism at its best, stepping up to address a crisis. A decade later, as COVID spread across the globe, there was no doubt which grouping of nations had to spring into action. From vaccines to supply chains, the G20 was the hub of coordination and cooperation. But while this body represents and acts extraordinarily well in a crisis, it has had trouble at times developing a sustainable agenda on a range of near and medium-term challenges facing the global economy, from debt distress to climate change. Now, that is understandable. Getting any group of countries to agree on anything is a challenge, especially when there's such a range of divergent views and priorities represented in the room. But it would be a colossal mistake to allow the geopolitical fractures of our time to prevent us from making progress on our shared challenges. We meet in an important historical marker. This week is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Bretton Woods Conference. That was a meeting of 44 nations, including the Soviet Union, held during World War II in the midst of a crisis. Over 3 weeks, they built a framework which will become the IMF and the World Bank. And I believe if they could meet the challenges of that time, there is surely nothing preventing us from meeting the challenges of our time. That is what animates our work at the Atlantic Council and our Bretton Woods 2.0 project, which you will hear more about throughout the day. And that is why we at the Atlantic Council are here in Rio this week. Now, it would not be possible for us to do this without incredible partners. As I mentioned, the US and Brazil are the two largest economies in the Western Hemisphere, as Secretary Yellen reminded us yesterday, and the future of the bilateral relationship between these countries will impact the entire global economy. We are pleased to play our own role in the bilateral partnership by partnering with SEBRI here in Brazil. So please join me in welcoming Teresa Rossi, T20 Executive Manager of SEBRI. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome once again. Throughout this morning, we will be discussing strategies to address the global challenges that are at the center of the discussions conducted by the Brazilian presidency of G20, ranging from climate change to sustainable development, energy transitions, and digital transformation, to the reform of the multilateral institutions that are the cornerstone of our global governance and international financial architecture. It is great to be having this discussion during a week that is critical for G20 and that was very important to attain the objectives of the Brazilian presidency. From the launch, the soft launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, to the development and finance ministerial meetings, it seems that the Brazilian presidency is being successful in achieving at least two of its major three priorities, which are combating hunger and poverty, promoting sustainable development, and reforming global governance. This year, SEBRI is coordinating the work of Think 20 alongside the Alexandre de Guzmão Foundation and the Institute for Applied Economic Research, IPEA. Among the several topics that are currently being discussed by the T20 Brazil community, SEBRI considers that energy transitions and digital transformation are key drivers of economic growth and social development in the 21st century, accelerating progress towards more resilient and sustainable economies. The need to promote economic decarbonization and energy transitions should be seen as an opportunity rather than an obligation that can potentially hinder economic growth. Promoting energy transitions is economically viable and attractive to the private sector. Private capital can account for approximately 3/4 or 75% of the resources needed to fund global energy transitions, which according to the International Energy Agency should correspond to an annual investment of 4.5 trillion until 2030. Even though concessional funding through grants and multilateral development banks, which need urgent reform, and this is going to be the topic of our next panel, they are fundamental to de-risk investments in low-income countries, but they will not be enough to bridge this financial gap. In this sense, G20 should also focus on promoting international cooperation to scale innovative blended finance mechanisms and create healthy business environments through best regulatory practices that can foster favorable conditions for long-term financing, lowering the cost of capital and leveraging private resources. Alongside energy transitions and directly contributing to leverage them, digital transformation is the other major pathway to economic growth in the 21st century. Developing countries can and have been investing in the digital economy as a strategy to increase economic productivity, create new jobs, promote social development, and achieve higher living standards, accelerating progress towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this sense, implementing public policies that link the digital transformation and sustainability agendas is key. Digital public infrastructures and the platformization of public services, an issue that will be discussed today, can significantly improve resource efficiency in critical sectors such as energy, health, and transportation. Brazil's Pix, China's WeChat, and successful experiences with microcredit in African countries also illustrate how digital technologies are revolutionizing the financial sector and including vulnerable populations that previously did not have access to banking services. These examples demonstrate that though digital transformation can promote exclusion and foster risks such as misinformation, they can also promote social inclusion and mitigate structural inequalities if properly conducted. SEBRI has specific programs on both of these issues, energy transformations and digital transformation, and has been working continuously with actors in the public and private sectors, as well as with national and international think tanks, such as the Atlantic Council, to construct a solid agenda and make sure that Brazil has a roadmap that links G20 to other events that the country will be presiding next year, such as BRIC Plus and COP30. This will guarantee that the window of opportunity opened by hosting these important international events will leave long-lasting positive effects, not only for Brazil, but for developing nations worldwide. Civil society and non-state actors have a critical role in guaranteeing that this window of opportunity will leave these lasting effects. And we are here to guarantee that civil society, through Think 20 and other engagement groups, have a pivotal role in managing the discussions, not only of G20, but of these other multilateral forums that are fastly approaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And we're going to go into our first session on revitalizing the multilateral development banks. And let me welcome to the stage Ananya Kumar, Deputy Director, Future of Money at Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, and our distinguished panel. Please join us.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, both in person and virtually. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Deputy Director for Future of Money at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel today. But before we start our discussion, which is going to be fantastic, I want to give a little bit of context of why we're doing this today, and why in Rio especially. About 3 weeks ago, on July 1st, we hosted an event that marked the first day of the Bretton Woods Conference 80 years ago. And that was a historical event. It was an event that looked at the history of the US and the UK in creating those institutions. This week, like Josh said, marks the 80th anniversary since the delegates signed the charter that formed the framework for the IMF and the IBRD, which would later become the World Bank. And we're excited to have both these original pillars of the Bretton Woods institution with us here today. The World Bank in this panel and the IMF in a panel later in the day. As the world has adjusted to the realities of the 60s and the 70s, primarily the need for capital by newly independent states in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, we saw the creation of regional development banks, two of which are represented here today as well. The IDB and the AIIB, the other banks like the African Development Bank, are also part of this sort of institutions of regional development banks that have to work with the World Bank and IMF. Next year is going to mark the fourth straight emerging market presidency of the G20. So emerging markets have been able to create the agenda at the G20 and have been able to push forward things that are important to them. It's not lost to me that the intentionally created first institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were created by the British. The G20 has allowed for emerging markets to have a voice in the agenda process as well. So today's discussion is going to talk about the realities of the economy that your MDBs face today. Climate finance, reform of the MDB, states informing your agenda, you informing the G20, and how to work better in that system. Felipe, I want to turn to you first. Felipe Jaramillo is the Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Ana Maria Ibanez is the Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the IDB. Renata Amaral is the Secretary for International Affairs and Development at the Ministry of Budget and Planning in Brazil. And Danny Alexander is the Vice President for Policy and Strategy at the AIIB. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion today. Felipe, as the representative of the original institution created 80 years ago, I'm going to turn to you first. How do you think that the World Bank's role in this complex and sort of growing system of MDBs and regional development banks has changed over time? And where do you see most of your energy going today?
Okay, you can hear me, right? Good. So thank you very much for the invitation. You were just reminding me, the importance of emerging countries in G20, and I was just rereading because of the 80th anniversary of the creation of the Bretton Woods Conference. At that Bretton Woods Conference, there were something like 40-some countries represented, and the original documents, the draft written by Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes, they were thinking of creating the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction. And there was a little footnote that said it might also do some development. And I was learning in these history books that because of those 40-some countries, 19 from Latin America, they said, look, reconstruction's fine. After the war, we can help, but can we do development too? Yeah. And as a result of that, it became IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So emerging markets of Latin America have been very instrumental from the beginning. So I'll say two things to summarize in answer to your question. The first one is I think the original creators of Bretton Woods would be very surprised by two things. Number one, the success since the creation of 80 years ago of development and how lives have been really transformed. You look at the social indicators back in 1944, 1945. Extreme poverty was about 60%. Mm-hmm. Today, extreme poverty around the world, less than 10%. So they would be surprised at how many social indicators have improved: health, education, you name it, infrastructure. Everything has improved really quite dramatically. Not only because of the creation of Bretton Woods, of course, but many countries have really improved their standards of living. The World Bank has, in our calculation, channeled in this period over $1.5 trillion since then of development aid to countries. So I think this is very positive. We always get lost in the negatives and all the problems, but there really has been a really positive period of development. So that's my first answer. The second answer is that I think they would also be surprised at how complicated the world has become, and particularly the last 4 years since the pandemic. I think they would have been very surprised that there was a really bad pandemic that caused a huge amount of lives and a massive crisis here in Latin America and the Caribbean, probably the worst crisis in a century in economic and social terms. And then they would be even more surprised that the pandemic was then followed by an inflation crisis, by a war again in Europe with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and fuel prices gone up, and they would be surprised at how complicated things have become. These intertwined crises that are all feeding on each other. Now we have so many countries having debt problems. So I think they would think, wow, there's still a lot to do. And I will end by saying I think the MDBs still have a lot of work to do. I work a lot with Ana Maria at the IDB and with friends from the other MDBs. I think that one of my biggest initiatives here is I think we need to work closer together. We are working closer together. We've signed an unprecedented high-level memorandum of understanding with the IDB on collaboration in a number of key areas, including the Amazon here in Brazil. And I think the challenges are so complex that we just need to work among the MDBs and with all the other partners much closer together.
Yeah, and to that point, the title of this panel is Aligning Approaches for Shared Goals, because the MDBs share so much in their ethos of what they want to do together, and coordination is very important. Ana Maria, you've been invoked already, but I want to ask you about, as a regional representative for Latin America and the Caribbean, where do you see sort of the most alignment with the World Bank, IMF, and other regional development banks, and where do you see the gaps in priorities, and what can be done better?
Thank you. First, let me thank you for inviting me here today to this interesting panel. Latin America and the Caribbean, if we implement the right reforms and policies, can overcome its many challenges. And very importantly so, Latin America and the Caribbean can provide solutions for the global challenges that we are facing today. We have food security, we have climate change, we have the protection of biodiversity. Let me give you two figures that are important. For example, the region produces supply food for 1.3 billion people at the moment, and we could expand production and provide much more food to the world. In biodiversity, the Amazon rainforest captures 25% of GHG emissions. So the Amazon plays a very important role and provides a very important public service to the world. However, when we see what's happening with middle-income countries in Latin America and the Caribbean is that we don't have enough funds, enough financing for these countries to overcome many of these challenges and to tackle these issues. Hence, I do believe that what is very important and for the MDBs to work together is to come with creative ways, and we are doing that precisely with the World Bank, to leverage financial resources to bring to the region. Because the funds that the MDB have are not sufficient, right? And we all know that. So we are doing several innovations, financial innovations, some jointly with the World Bank and with other institutions that I do believe are important. Let me give you some examples. The first one is the SDRs, the special drawing rights that can be really a powerful tool to scale up our actions to help eradicate poverty and extreme hunger. So the decision of the IMF to allow MDBs to rely on those SDRs and to rechannel those for development purposes is very important. For each dollar that the instrument provides, at least 4 can be used. No, so that can be leveraged through the MDBs. So that's going to imply massive resources to the developing regions, which is important. But also we need to leverage resources from financial capitals, private sector. Us alone, as I said, cannot do it, and we can do it through many instruments. We can use financial instruments, we can use grants, we can use guarantees, we can use loan pricing to help overcome these coordination failures and market vulnerabilities that we're facing. And we have some recent initiatives that can be interesting. One is IDB Clima, which is something that is just from the IDB. This is a loan. These are loans that we provide to countries that have climate and nature goals that can be verifiable. And if they are able to achieve those goals, we reduce 5% of the principal of the loan. So that's something that is important. We have the incentives for countries to put in place the verification process and to achieve these goals. Hence, we are also creating institutional capacity. And the third one that I wanted to mention, that this is something that we are doing with the World Bank, is the Brazil's Eco Invest Hub, which is supported by the IDB, is supported by the World Bank, amongst other institutions. And basically what we're trying to do is to lower investment costs by helping investors manage the long-term currency risks. So we are developing local currency markets and hedging instruments, which is important. So I do believe that when we join forces, we can do much more than when we do it together. And when designing these innovative financial instruments, we can bring more capital to our region and to the other regions for achieving the goals that we have.
Thank you. Danny, I have the same question for you, but with your membership in Perspective, which is primarily in Asia, where do you see the most alignment in goals? Where do you see some gaps emerging between your goals and other MDB goals?
I mean, I think that the key issue today is the scale of the global challenges that we're facing, right? So whether it's climate change and the trillions of dollars of financing that's needed in developing countries, but also in developed countries. The fact that as a consequence of the pandemic and inflation that was referred to earlier also, we are way, way behind in terms of achieving the sustainable development goals. And so, the key agenda over the last 3 G20 presidencies with Brazil, with India, with Indonesia, is what can the world do to up its game on these challenges? And we've got to up our game during this decade, because if we don't, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are 2030. But with climate change, if we don't up our game now, we'll miss the chance to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So there is a sense of urgency and a sense of the scale of the challenge. And what the G20 and in COP meetings and so on have alighted on, and this is both a compliment and a challenge to the MDB system, is to say we have to build bigger, better, more effective multilateral development banks in order to meet these challenges. And that means enabling MDBs to scale up their financing. It means MDBs working together more effectively as a system, right? So this is something that our president, Jin Lichun, started talking about a couple of years ago. He proposed that we should have the first MDB heads retreat. That took place in April this year under the leadership of Ilan Goldfein, the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. And through that process, we published a viewpoint notes. Viewpoint note sets out from the NDB's perspectives, what are the different areas where we need to deepen our collaboration. I think any fair observer of the MDBs over the past few decades would say these are very good organizations, doing very good things, but they don't work together as effectively as they should. And to describe them as a system is perhaps a misuse of the term. So there is now very clear commitment that we should become working together as a system, and that covers a whole range of different areas. It's about how do we deploy our financing together to enable. I mean, you mentioned that in Latin America, AIB also works in Latin America, although most of our business is in Asia. Co-financing. So together with the World Bank and 7 other MDBs, in April we launched the MDB co-financing platform, which is designed to enable MDBs to show each other projects where we need the scale of resources that one bank can't provide by itself, but others have to come together. We're talking about mutual reliance in terms of standards and policies at the project level. We all have basically the same high standards in terms of environmental and social safeguards, procurement, fiduciary, anti-corruption. These things are enormously important to the quality of the things that we finance and as kind of risk mitigant mechanisms in different ways. Our policies are basically the same, but there are a little bit differences in certain places. And the sort of narcissism of small differences means that, if you're a client working with multiple MDBs, you probably have to do multiple assessments of the same thing against basically the same standards, but in slightly different ways. So mutual reliance means, can we find ways that when we're working with a client, we say, you do this job once, and you do it in a way that we could all rely upon. Now, AIB is a new institution, anyway, young, perhaps young. Is the first new multilateral development bank of the 21st century. We had the opportunity and the good fortune to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants, to be able to look at the experience of other MDBs and say, we are part of the gene pool of this system. The core features are the same, but other things that we can learn about. So when we were framing our environmental and social policy, we wrote into that when we're co-financing with another MDB and we have basically the same standards and we assess that they're as the same level as we are, then we can rely on their work for our approval processes rather than having to duplicate. That does mean that we can be more efficient. It means that we can, I think, crucially reduce the burdens on the clients, which is a critical issue if we want to scale up development finance. So I think those are the things where we can kind of work together. Raphael mentioned, Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes in the framing of the Bretton Woods institutions. One of the things that they disagreed about was whether the board of directors of these institutions should be resident or non-resident. John Maynard Keynes proposed that there should be a non-resident board, and in the end, Harry Dexter White and others won the argument for resident boards. So AIB has taken the Keynesian approach to this question. And we have a non-resident board. We can make use of new technology and so forth for communications. They meet regularly, face to face as well as virtually, and that's something which, in AIB's context, works very well. It creates a clearer division of responsibility between the boards and the managements, and therefore I think also strengthens accountability. So I think that responding to the global challenges, the NDB system has really stepped up, but we have a lot to do, right? So we've made a lot of commitments. You can read all the documents. We have the responsibility to bring these things to life in order that the scale of financing that we can provide is necessary to meet the challenges that are there.
Yeah, and on your point on reducing the burden on your clients, what we hear from your clients often is the number of forms they have to fill out in order to become clients. And I'm glad that is a sort of shared goal for everyone. And if you have the same standards, that becomes a lot easier to make effective over time. Renata, I want to turn to you as the representative from Brazil this year. We talked about how bigger better and more effective MDBs have become sort of the catchphrase of the G20 process. Both India and Brazil have identified that the reform of the MDB system as one of their main goals. I want to ask you why that is for Brazil first, and how do you envision it happening this week?
Thank you so much. First of all, let me say that it's a pleasure to be here with the Atlantic Council. It reminds me of my life in DC, so it's always a pleasure. And I was going to be more open about what I was going to say, but then somebody else from the government just arrived. So I have to control myself now, and it's Itamaraty.
Be
You have to
very
be careful with those people. Always be careful. But I'm just kidding. Good to see you, Felipe. But as the Minister of Planning and Budget, let me just explain. We manage Brazil's participation in regional development banks as shareholder. So the IDB, the African Development Bank, CAF, Fomplata, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the Finance Minister manages the relationship as a shareholder with the others. So Ana Maria is the luckiest here. I'm kidding. But the World Bank, the AIIB, and DB is as shareholder, Brazil's shareholders with finance. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to Brazil as a borrower from the banks, it all comes to us. Planning. So I chair the External Finance Commission in Brazil, very closely together with the Treasury Secretary. So it's not working? Okay. And so at the end of the day, we deal with every multilateral development banks that provides external finance to Brazil with sovereign guarantee. We have been closely working together with the MDBs also on the strategy for Brazil. So we are trying to bring everyone together to be closer to the priorities of the federal government as well. For example, we just approved by the end of last year the green sub-limit for projects. It's $500 million that are only dedicated to projects that are fully green, sustainable. So this money is going to start to be used now in the next meeting of the Commission in September. And this is one of the examples that I wanted to bring, because this was something that was built from the experience from the MDBs, and it matches the priorities of the federal government. We are also talking about gender and other priorities here, of course. I'm going to mention this later, but there is a specific sublimit for the green projects. It doesn't have to do exactly with the eco-invest, which I'm going to mention. The IDB and the World Bank are also involved. It's a bigger program with finance that is going to be also approved by the Brazilian government. The IDB has been approved. The World Bank is on the way. But regarding G20, we do strongly believe in that sense that the MDBs are very powerful tools to achieve the main priorities of our presidency this year. So the fight against hunger and poverty and inequalities, and the support to sustainable finance especially, and inclusive development, and fight against climate change. So we do think that, and from my experience from these 18 months in government, we do get a lot of information from the MDBs, what we are doing now in the country and in the region. So it has been a very close relationship and building together a strategy for the banks in our country, in our region as well. So one thing that I also think it's important to mention in this first intervention is that we know that we are very behind of the SDGs and the Paris climate pledges, and the MDBs are also important institutions to bring us closer to the goals we have, to the 2030 agenda. So in this context, as Daniel was mentioning, the MDBs have a crucial role in scaling up investment, in mobilizing public and private resources, generating knowledge to help countries to achieve, to accelerate actually their path to the 2030 agenda and a less carbon-intensive and more sustainable economy as a whole. So that being said, Brazil's G20's presidency is making big efforts to deliver concrete proposals, as you were mentioning as well, Daniel, to enhance the multilateral development banks to be better bigger and more effective to especially to developing countries, right? And in that sense, we are promoting under the leadership of the finance minister in the finance track, the implementation of the capital adequacy framework initiative. We might talk about this later a little bit more. Leading significant discussions on callable capital. We had a big discussion on this at the African Development Bank in this last annual meeting in May. The special drawing rights channeling, and the very important announcement that was made yesterday by Elon Goldfein together with President Adesina, Inter-American Development Bank and African Development Bank on using SDRs for the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and also hybrid capital issuance that I think you also mentioned, right? You know, so these efforts can contribute to the expansion of the IDBs, and we believe make them more effective and responsible to the crises and challenges we have nowadays.
Yeah. Thank you, Renata. And I think we've been talking about the MDBs as a system, although it's probably more accurate to call it MDBs as a network across the world. The issue we've identified is how to be complementary of each other's work without being overlapping or just ignoring parts that need to get done. Felipe, I want to turn to you on this question. What sort of processes are needed? And Danny and Renata have identified a few for complementarity between the MDBs. And how do you see, as a follow-up question, how do you see the G20 contributing to any kind of process?
Thank you. I think, what I would say that is the most important thing is to listen to the countries, to listen to the ones who are our clients. We often don't do enough of that, especially when we've grown to become large bureaucracies, large institutions. This is why I spend, and I think Ana Maria does too, we spend a lot of time traveling and staying for days in each country to listen to people like Renata, who works in the government, to tell us what are Brazil's priorities, what do they really need. So right now it's a lot about, as she said, create the financial instruments. How do we leverage? Clearly, for the problem of climate change, we don't have the money. We have money. We're putting a lot of it. I don't know. The World Bank this year, I think over the last 12 months, we delivered about 90-some billion in financial assistance, of which 45% went to these climate co-benefits. So about 40 billion in this. This is nothing compared to the needs that are required for the big transition. So how do we mobilize the private sector? How do we, with the IDB together, we're working on helping countries, not only on the mitigation side, which is good. By the way, many of the countries, middle-income countries, want more concessional finance. And we have come up, I think IDB does too, with creative ways to reward a country that goes beyond its Paris commitments. So with Uruguay, we have already this new mechanism that we've approved. If they control methane levels because of their cattle industry to lower emissions than what they committed to, we will be year by year measuring, and we'll give them a buy down on their interest. That's something we have never done before. This is fantastic. We need more of these ideas. But we also need to work on climate adaptation, because there's a lot of excitement about mitigation, which is great, but Latin America is not a major contributor to the problem of climate change. We're more like a recipient of the problems. We just saw the really early massive hurricane in the Caribbean. So it's about creative things. We just adopted, I think the IDB did too, this climate resilient debt clause. If a hurricane hits an island state, we are going to allow the country, if it wants, to suspend all debt payments for up to 2 years, if they want, so they can use the money for the pressing issues at hand. That's something we hadn't done before, and it's because of climate adaptation. And also, as I think both Renata and Ana Maria mentioned, for climate adaptation, the Amazon is critical. The Amazon is, also for biodiversity and for the people who live there, the Amazon is critical. We are working very closely together, coming up with ways to help protect parts of the Amazon that need to be protected, and also to help give income opportunities and educational opportunities to the population who lives there that doesn't destroy the forest. So those are the kinds of challenges, I think.
Thank you. And because we've turned to the topic of climate, what we're talking about is about a $4.5 trillion deficit or gap in financing. We need about 4 times more money raised, both from the MDBs, from public spending, but also from the private sector, primarily to help us achieve those adaptation and mitigation projects. And how to balance them both has always been a challenge. We're also operating in, always operating in an era of fiscal constraints and fiscal pressures, at least, and the need to balance long-term goals with short-term goals. Like you said, Amazon is very specifically tied to, the future of Latin America, the future of really how countries adapt to climate change. Ana Maria, I wanted to turn to you about what is a successful and innovative, as Felipe has been talking about. What does success look like, and what do successful projects in the region look like for adaptation and mitigation needs? How do you balance them? How do you think about long-term strategy versus short-term strategy? And Anata, I'll turn to you after.
Yes, I think that's a very important question, and it's a very important question for Latin America. As Felipe mentioned, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have mitigation goals, but we also have the need of adapting to climate change. And those needs are huge. So what we need is really to find projects that overlap. I mean, projects that do mitigation and projects that do adaptation as well. That sometimes is easy, sometimes it is not. Let me mention some projects that we are doing currently with climate finance and climate projects that I think are interesting. The first one is one in Dominican Republic that we just approved last week, and it's a project for building resilience of bridges in Dominican Republic. As you all know, the Caribbean islands are very vulnerable to hurricanes and to natural disasters, and one of the big problems they have is bridges. Because bridges connect the roads, and bridges are not resilient to these natural disasters and to the hurricanes. So basically what we did is that we came up with a way to identify which are the bridges that are vulnerable to these natural disasters, 1,200 bridges, and then we provided funding for improving the resilience of those bridges. So these are very important. This is a very important project that is going to increase the resilience in Dominican Republic. A second one, which also is related to what Danny was talking about, when we bring several institutions to just one project, is a project that we approved yesterday for Barbados, and it's a project where we are using financial instruments and we are using our operations to improve water resilience and water scarcity in Barbados, which is a big problem in Barbados. And in this project, we are bringing together the EAIB, the Global Climate Fund, and we are all working together to help the country really achieve those goals. And we are doing what Danny was saying. Let's use the institutions' policies so that the government doesn't have to coordinate with each of the policies, but we, the multilateral development banks, coordinate amongst ourselves, pay the cost of coordinating, which sometimes are large in time. But then we do the project. So that's another thing that I believe it is important. Some other projects that really overlap climate mitigation and climate adaptation that are important. In this project for climate finance, for example, we are working with adaptation by improving water scarcity and the use of water. But also we are doing mitigation because we are installing solar panels for the plant. And for example, we are helping the region build resilient schools for natural disasters, but those resilient schools for natural disasters also have a mitigation component with solar panels and using renewable energy. So we are trying to find this overlap between mitigation and adaptation. Sometimes we can do it, sometimes it is not easy, but I think that's an important way to leverage resources for the region as well.
Right. Renata, please, same question to you. Brazil was hit by devastating floods earlier this year. This is a very imminent issue for emerging markets like Brazil. It's become obviously a topic at the G20. It's a topic that you probably deal with on a day-to-day as someone who lives here. what do you think successful and innovative projects in Brazil specifically, but Latin America look like? And where do you see the most need for financing?
Excellent. I think what we had in the south of the country a few months ago was very remarkable in a bad way to all of us. We did a coordination with all the banks, actually. We brought everyone together with the government to try to find out what can we do. And I'll take this opportunity actually to publicly make a request, because one thing that we found out from that experience in Rio Grande do Sul is that we have very little technical assistance dedicated to the country from MDBs, to be honest, because. Of course, we send a lot of money. There was a lot of money mobilized to the state, to the municipalities, but the state, for example, cannot get any more money because the debt is like, I don't know when they're going to be able to execute the money and to pay the debt. So in that experience, we found like several issues that we need to pay attention. One is we need more technical assistance from MDBs in that, especially on that kind of catastrophic situations. Right. We need to have a trigger for this kind of situations, especially climate. And we have been talking to Treasury. We need we are trying to convince internally the government that we need to have some money, some loans just waiting there for the trigger when we need them. That's not easy to approve inside of the government, but I think we need definitely to think about that. There is a discussion on creating a fund also specifically for catastrophic situations. So the Rio Grande do Sul situation made a lot of problems just rise, and it is tough. It is tough to coordinate, especially in a big country like Brazil, the federal, the state, and the municipal level. It's very hard, and then you get all the political side of the things coming up, which is not easy. But I think we did at least a good reflection job together, joint planning and finance with all the banks. Like, what can we do better? How can we prevent these situations to happen in the future? At least we cannot prevent, but can we be ready or right to respond? Because the Rio Grande do Sul is still, and in the first 2 weeks, everybody was talking about Rio Grande do Sul.
Yeah.
Who talks about Rio Grande do Sul nowadays?
Yeah.
Nobody. And that's scary. It's really scary. But in the backstage, we are working to develop instruments that can be more effective and ready to answer to those kind of situations. And let me just mention again the EcoInvest, the program that both banks are bringing to Brazil. It's a little bit of a headache for me because you're eating all the sovereign guarantee for the federal level, but it's for a good cause. They're very expensive programs because together they're going to dedicate $2 billion for green projects. And it's going to leverage also private capital. I think this kind of solutions that they are bringing to the country and then can be translated to other countries, to the region, it's super important, super important.
Thank you, and thank you for raising the specific issue of the floods. I think there's 2 points there that you raised that are very important for MDBs, but also state and local and national governments. One is that you are constantly and increasingly responding to immediate crises as you are trying to plan for something longer term. So the adaptation, mitigation, you're trying to create short-term adaptation, long-term adaptation, short-term mitigation, and long-term mitigation. It's just sort of a very complex problem to figure out. The other issue is, technical assistance gaps, of course, that you're talking about. Danny, I want to turn to you about for a related question about how do you strategically manage those issues of gaps in technical assistance, gaps in financing, while trying to think about long and short-term goals on both adaptation and mitigation measures. And then a third issue, if I can, of leveraging private capital. You know, MDBs try to talk of themselves as not just lending institutions, but something that can leverage private capital. How do you do that? Where do you see successful examples?
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, maybe the first thing to say is I do see climate finance as the area where MDBs come closest to working as a system now.
Yeah.
I think actually there's very good collaboration on all of these issues. So, for example, over the last 2 years, all the MDBs have implemented what we call Paris alignment. Means in addition to climate finance, every single project must be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And one of the things that does, which is very relevant to the point about adaptation and resilience, is that every project has to be looked at from the perspective of climate change mitigation and from the perspective of adaptation. So that process forces us to do something I think we were all trying to do anyway, but perhaps not completely consistently, which is to say, for any project that we finance, building in resilience to what climate change is going to throw at us over the next few decades is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we'll end up in a increasingly sort of short cycle of constantly trying to fight disasters and rebuild, but with better levels of adaptation and resilience. You know, I was in the British government before going to AIB. I remember back in 2010, there were catastrophic floods in Pakistan. There was a big international effort was mobilized. We talked then about building in resilience. Then in the terrible floods in Pakistan, a year ago?
A year ago.
Much of the same infrastructure was destroyed, sadly, because we hadn't thought far enough ahead. And so, you know, a big part of working with that country in the flood response this time is to say, how can we really build in the level of adaptation and resilience that is realistic to the worst case scenarios that may come? And I think that's an area where MDB collaboration is working. Second thing I wanted to say, which is related to this, is that collaboration at the institutional level is good, but it's only good if it's also matched by collaboration at the country level. So one of the initiatives being discussed under the Brazil's G20 presidency, and it was brought up in India last year, is about so-called country platforms. Where it's about saying all the development partners should be together around one table, led by the country, with the country in the driving seat, to say, this is what we need. This is what our agenda is. This is what our strategy is. This is where your knowledge, your advice, your financing can really help us the most, to build the right policies, to finance the right projects, to do so that at the country level, MDBs are not sort of fighting with each other, who gets the best projects, but instead thinking about how can we make sure that our resources are maximized to the good of the development agenda of the country. Just as an example, AIB last month approved a new instrument. I've been working on our board with this for about a year. We call it climate policy-based financing. So for IDB and World Bank, policy-based financing has been part of their toolkit for many, many years. Had not been part of AIB's toolkit. We decided not to say we want to open this up to any area, but specifically and only to have it for climate, with two goals. One is adaptation and resilience, getting the policy frameworks right, supporting countries to do that. The second is mobilizing private capital for climate transition. Because when you look at the challenges facing getting the private sector in, there are a number of different issues. Of course, policy and regulatory environments is a critical part. So policy financing that is targeted to work with the country to help them put in place an environment that's more attractive to the private sector will have an effect in terms of making it easier for private capital to flow. Second is about risk appetite and kind of risk reward, where MDBs have the capacity to mitigate some of the risks that make it easier for private capital to come in. But I do also want to pick up this point about technical assistance. So I think it's a really important one, about where do concessional resources go? Unfortunately, there's not an unlimited supply of concessional finance in the world. That's the challenge. So again, one of the issues in the G20 is to say, related to the climate transition, to what extent can concessional resources also be directed towards middle-income countries that need to scale up their climate work, or that are facing these adaptation and resilience challenges? Now, with a finite supply of money, that's a very difficult trade-off, because there are, extraordinary development needs in many low-income countries in the world. But we have to look at, Are we using those resources in the right way? Are we leveraging them in the right way? But also, are we building the right partnerships? For example, philanthropic capital can come in this space as well. And so I think, a key issue for MDBs, which we all do already, but is how can we scale, is about blended finance, bringing different kinds of money together, private sector, philanthropic, MDB finance, concessional resources, in a way that enables us to build not just really good individual projects, but systems that can really get the private sector to be in more actively in these development challenges.
Renata, please go ahead.
Just one quick comment, taking on your point of working with the countries. One thing that I realized is we are shareholders of all those banks.
Yeah.
We need to say our priorities and set it on and explain to the banks what we need. Because most of the times what I feel is that countries don't act as shareholders, actually, as owners of the banks, right? So this is something very important to all of this to be successful. Work together and bring the strategy of the bank to fit the priorities of the countries, and then we can deliver more concrete results. And that's not a given. Not all the countries. Actually, Brazil, I think we are really reflecting on this. Like, we are owners of the bank. We need to work together. It's not a separate entity.
Yeah.
It's a group working together.
No, I take all those points. I want to turn to some of the other issues that have been brought up by the G20 presidencies that have been a part of the MDB system and domestic sort of policy strategies for a long time. One of them is hunger alleviation and poverty alleviation. So we're meeting this week on the sidelines of the Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty meetings that have been organized by Brazil. Of course, Brazil is the largest exporter of agricultural products to a lot of emerging markets and developed economies around the world. Under President Lula, hunger and poverty have become a big focus of your domestic agenda as well. Felipe, I'm going to start with you. I know the World Bank's been involved in the Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty meetings. What have you gathered from that, and sort of what are the next steps leading up to the leaders' meeting in November on that issue specifically?
Okay, so let me say maybe three things on that really important initiative that I feel very happy. Going back to 80 years ago, I think the Bretton Woods founders would be very happy that President Lula and the government of Brazil has put its spotlight again on poverty and hunger, because we were very distracted with other things, and it really. So the first thing I'd like to say is that this Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty comes at a very good time when the attention has been diffused in other things, and it really is important to realize, I think this report just came out, hunger is on the rise. Poverty has been on the rise, especially among the lower income countries and in the lower segments of populations in middle income countries. So I'm very, very happy that Brazil has put that initiative forward. The World Bank is fully supportive. So yesterday, our president, that was my second point, announced full support. We are going to be helping. We understand and we know very well the Brazilian successful experience with a number of programs, starting with, of course, Bolsa Familia, and how it managed to lift a lot of people out of the worst of poverty, and how to take that around the world to many countries that still have not adopted these kinds of effective registries and targeting to the most vulnerable communities, and how to get that money, that lifeline very quickly to them. And also family farming for smallholders, a little bit on school lunches that are also very important for nutrition. It's a nice policy package that is very important. So we're going to be supporting that in a very big way. The fleshing out of this, I think, will come out in the next few months after the Leaders Summit. But my third point is the World Bank has jumped on this. Our president yesterday here in Rio announced a doubling of our ambition for social protection. Bolsa Familia and all these targeted transfers precisely to help countries have safety nets so that populations really don't suffer from hunger and malnutrition. And so our target was 250 million people over the next 5 or 6 years. Now he's told us we need to double that to 500 million people. And I think in Latin America, we'll have at least 100 million,
Yep.
including in Brazil, included in that target.
No, and the total number we're talking about is about 11% of the world's population lives in food insecurity. That's about 900 million people. 500 is an ambitious target, but there's still sort of a half that needs to be achieved through leveraging collective resources here. I want to turn to the other part of it, which is poverty and financial inclusion, probably closest to my work at the council as well. I know the IDB has been involved in a lot of work on financial inclusion measures in LATAM and Caribbean. I want to give you the chance to talk about a few of those projects and the future leading up to the Leaders Summit in November.
Thank you. First, let me address a little some of the issues that,
Sure.
that Felipe mentioned, because I think are important for Latin America and the Caribbean. The first one is about food insecurity, because food insecurity in our region has been on the rise since 2014. So it's not something, a current shock, it's something that has been gradually progressing in a negative way throughout the years, and that shouldn't be the case. No? So it's very important that we deal with the consequences and the causes of food insecurity, and it's something that's very important, and that's why the alliance it's crucial for Latin America and the Caribbean as well, which is a middle-income region for most of the countries, but we are facing problems with food insecurity. The second important thing that I believe Felipe mentioned is the social protection programs, and this overlaps very importantly with adaptation, because we really need to change and adjust our social protection system such that we adapt to climate change and to the consequences of climate change. So social protection systems need to be adaptive. And we are doing some projects in Latin America for that and helping the countries for doing that. On financial inclusion in our region, it is incredible, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, it is really an underserved region in terms of financial services for the poor. About 27% of people aged 14 and older are excluded from financial services. And when you compare that to high-income countries, it's 3%. During the pandemic, something very interesting happened is that since we were transferring the cash transfers through digital services, then financial inclusion increased significantly. And that is a very important benefit from the pandemic. So let me give you 3 examples of financial inclusion that we're doing. The first one is on knowledge, that Renata mentioned that our banks play an important role on knowledge, and we have there something that is important. So for this, we launched FinLac, which is an initiative that we launched this year. And the purpose of this initiative is to generate knowledge. It's to generate data on financial inclusion. It's testing innovative business models with our private sector branches, IDB Invest and IDB Lab. And this is using this evidence to turn it into action with the governments and with the private sector. So that's something that we are doing at the moment. And FinLac is helping companies and governments design and implement these effective policies. The website has a lot of data. I urge you to look into the website. It's data that you can use on financial inclusion that is interesting. We are doing things also in the back end to help really increase the use of digital and payment services. And for that, we team up with the Bank of International Settlements to launch the FUSE, Fully Scalable Settlement Engine. And basically what this is doing is offering central banks open source technology to help simplify payment systems. This is very important to increase financial inclusion and the use of digital services. And on the other hand, we have very interesting programs and projects that we are doing with SMEs, with small firms. Recently, again, we approved a project for the Amazon with BNDES. It is a project that is a very large project with 1 billion that is called Pro Amazonia. And basically what we're doing is that we are using BNDES to funnel money to SMEs in the Amazon region. When you look into the Amazon region is very important because it's for protecting for capturing GHG emissions, but 70% of the population in the Amazon live in cities. So we need to support these cities to be productive. So this program provides credits to SMEs to increase productivity, but also with a very important component for protecting the environment and for protecting biodiversity in the Amazon. So this is a program that we did to increase financial inclusion for SMEs in the Amazon, and we are looking into it very closely. We know it's going to be very successful.
Thank you. And like I said, the issue of financial inclusion closely tied with digital transformation. You brought up the example of payments during the pandemic driving a sort of digitization. That has been true for everywhere in the world, but especially true for Brazil, which coincidentally was also launching Pix and other sort of payments platforms around the same time. So that sort of overlap has really specifically impacted Brazil. Daniel, I want to turn to you on the issue of digital transformation. I know that AIIB is also specifically invested in a lot of digital transformation projects in Asia and in other places. Where do you see that going, and what sort of is driving your agenda leading up to the Leaders Summit in November?
Thank you. So it's an important agenda, and so we made digital infrastructure, infotech, one of the 4 pillars of our corporate strategy, alongside green finance, cross-border connectivity, and private capital mobilization. We see that infrastructure and construction in general are 2 of the least digitized sectors globally, right? They've been slowest to adopt digital technology, and yet we see both enormous opportunities for countries to digitize, and the social inclusion benefits that just been talked about. You see the same thing in Asia. We saw in the pandemic, those countries that have well-established telecommunications, digital infrastructure, were much better able to manage that. But also we see that in traditional infrastructure sectors, if you can apply the right technology, then you can save money, you can manage better, you can reduce emissions, and many other benefits besides. So earlier this year, we launched an Infotech portal, which is a free, open-to-use service, which is about highlighting digital solutions, Infotech solutions, that can be applied to infrastructure projects of many, many kinds. We see that as a value addition to our clients, but we also see, by providing that as an open access platform, that we can bring together many project providers and others. AIB itself, we've invested in all kinds of digital projects. We supported Indonesia for a satellite project which brought broadband connections to 13,000 outlying islands of the Indonesian archipelago. We've supported projects in China and in India related to digital healthcare, which is a critical way to improve healthcare, especially primary healthcare services in the developing world. And we see this as a major agenda going forward. So I think in the context of the G20, we work with Indonesia's presidency and with India's looking at bringing forward a kind of compendium of digital solutions that can be applied to different kinds of infrastructure challenges. And I think Brazil has also picked up that agenda. So we look forward to working on it further, including perhaps under South Africa next year.
Yeah, and leading up to the US's presidency in 2026, which is going to be the first advanced economy presidency of the G20 after 4 years. It's going to be interesting where that agenda goes. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about digital transformation. Obviously, a lot of discussion on climate finance, what Brazil needs specifically, what Latin America needs, where MDBs need to finance the gap and how that could be done. How do we think about long-term goals, short-term goals? How do we finance projects that achieve multiple goals at the same time, as Ana Maria said? And how do we complement each other's work across regional MDB system and MDBs at large? I'm going to turn to my last question, and I'll ask Renata first, and then all of you. We're meeting on the sidelines, like I've said, of the finance minister and central bank governors meeting in Rio. What is the successful outcome for this week look like for you, Renata, for Brazil specifically?
I think one thing that the Brazilian government has been saying since the beginning, I guess Felipe will agree with me, I hope so, is that we really would like to bring the Sherpa and finance track together, to work together. And the alliance is one attempt to do so. So I do believe that if we can manage to bring the discussions closer, that's a win for everyone. it's not easy to do so. We know because the Sherpa track covers a world of topics, right? And the finance track has more specific issues to deal with on the tax issues on MDBs. But I think one success would mean to bring them closer, and I do think that the alliance and channeling financial instruments to the alliance, it's a way to bring the discussions together. So, of course, we are governors of the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, so we have been following the special drawing rights discussion closely. So I think bringing this and leveraging this to the alliance, it will mean success for me.
Thank you. Felipe, to you, what does success look like at the end of the week for the World Bank?
So my personal success, my view of success, this is a 1-year long process, so there's many things going on.
Of course, yeah.
Renata just mentioned there's the finance track, there's a lot of ideas, but my own personal number one is that an emerging nation like Brazil has put back on the agenda poverty and hunger on the table for the G20 and for the world. Brazil was an important country represented at the Bretton Woods conference. And I think those Brazilians who went there would be proud that, again, Brazil, back then lobbied for making sure that the bank was not about only reconstructing Europe, but, having really a global aim. And so doing this here, I feel it's a very important moment. And yesterday, with President Lula again, we discussed about the needs of low-income countries. We focus a lot on Latin America. It's mainly middle-income countries, but really the ones who are worse off are lower-income countries, many of them in Africa. And I was very happy to hear that Brazil will come back again to IDA, the International Development Agency, and Brazil will actually be a shareholder and put some money on the table to help those countries and bring the successful examples from Brazil.
Thank you. Ana Maria, to you.
Yes, I think I'm going to repeat what everybody is saying, but anyhow, I do believe there are many successes. The first one is what Felipe and Renata were mentioning, putting the spotlight on poverty, hunger, and inequality, because also the G20 did a joint declaration about inequality that I believe it's important. That's an important success. The second important success is how this G20 process throughout this year has made us work together, the MDBs, to continue working on the viewpoint, as Danny mentioned, that I believe it's important, and to really recognize the importance of us working together. No? And if we want to leverage additional funds, and if we really want to work with the countries and work with a sense of purpose, saying the needs of the countries should be our main objective, what's happening with the country platforms, what's happening with all these vertical climate initiatives that we are working on is something that is going to be very important and is creating the stepping stones for future endeavors that are going to be very important for our countries, and I think that's an important success of what we've been doing.
Thank you. Danny, last word.
I think with the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, the week is already a success.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, I think we should remember that actually there are huge geopolitical divisions in the world. And so the fact that under Brazil's leadership, a consensus can be formed involving all parties in the G20 around this MDB reform, bigger, better, bolder MDBs, the role of MDBs, and all the countries coming together to say, we support this, we want to help you do more, I think is a tremendous achievement, honestly. Given the state of the world, getting all the different countries around the table to sign up to this one agenda is an extraordinary achievement.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you for your time here today. I want to thank everyone here in Rio for joining us for this conversation, everyone joining online. We're going to continue the conversation on a lot of these issues that we have identified today. specifically on food security and hunger, where my colleague Valentina Sater is going to lead a conversation, but also on MDB reform, on Brazil's priorities, on digital payments and digital transformation at large. And I'm very excited for the rest of our day. So thank you all, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Around the world is causing primarily women and children, once again, to be the brunt of what happens and the ones that suffer the most when there's no food available. We also talk about climate change. Climate change is a huge factor, particularly in North Africa, but also in Asia and parts of Central and South America, as we know. We've seen the flooding. We've seen the amounts of tragedies that have occurred around the world, and what they're faced with. India was the most recent one, where where so many people, or Pakistan, I guess it was, sorry, where the floods were absolutely enormous and no one expected it. So those are the kinds of things. Yes, that's an emergency situation, but it turns into a food security situation as we roll further into the time away from when it happened. Right now, there are up to 75 million people. That means 1 in 11 on our planet that are chronically hungry. We have the capability as a planet to feed everybody on the planet. We grow enough food. We have the ability to do so, but we don't, and we can't in some cases, or we simply aren't funded or mechanized in a way where we can actually do that. 60% of these people are women and little girls. 60% of the hungry people in the world. That's a number that should not exist. But once again, women and children are taking the brunt of what's going on, and you've never seen more of an example of it than in Gaza, in terms of the food issue there. I would like to say the global hunger levels right now are where they were in 2009. We've lost all the progress that we've made in the past 15 years, so we're back to square one. And so that is why the G20 taking on this particular issue and trying to not only encourage but bring other countries to the table. We cannot solve this problem alone, and governments can't solve this problem alone. It has to be a combination of governments, private partnerships, specific interests, think tanks, all the things that we knew, but it has to be action-based. My biggest beef with the UN many times is that we talk a whole lot and we don't do a lot. And so I come from an arena with my husband, as you know, where we were totally action-based. So they have a very impatient person who runs WFP because I want to see outcomes in action. That could be good or bad. Let me, but reminding everyone that this particular issue, food security generally, is a national security issue, and it should be labeled as one, because it's not, this isn't a woman's issue either. I love it when people say, well, that's a woman's issue. It is not a woman's issue. It's very much a man's issue. And so food security is national security, and we're beginning to see the global organizations like Munich Security, like Halifax and others, who are framing it as such. That's very important to how we deal with it in the future and how we have access to how we can actually mitigate all of this. I hope that answers your question.
It does, but as a national security and international security issue that requires so much cooperation, what do you think are the risks of failing to tackle this effectively?
Starvation. The risk is that the planet will fold. People won't have enough food to eat. Food insecurity brings national security problems, and we've seen it in Northern Africa. We're seeing it in Somalia. We're seeing it in Sudan and Yemen right now, and other places as well. And you take a place like Ukraine, as you know, they're inching in, taking away and mining all of the agricultural profiles within Ukraine. That will become an issue. It already is an issue globally, as we know, because we used to, at least WFP and other organizations, used to get the bulk of our grain from Ukraine. And now that simply isn't the case. We get some of it, but we can't get all of it anymore. So we have to, not only that, we have to diversify where we get our goods and services, but where other countries can get it as well. And also giving our countries, the ones that are on the lower end of being able to mitigate this, the tools and the expertise to do just that. It's something that we as WP, and I know this is what the G20 is doing, is making sure that we can offer these kinds of things so countries can lift themselves up and try to mitigate the effect on its people.
The World Food Program and you in particular have been such a big part of the project of the Global Alliance and of many other initiatives that aim to tackle hunger in the world. Why is it so relevant that this initiative is being created within the scope of the G20 in particular?
Well, the G20 is an incredible organization that brings people together, brings organizations together, brings countries together. So the voice is huge. It's absolutely huge. That's why we didn't have to ask, we didn't have to go far. Brazil was on front and center in wanting to take on this issue. I'm very grateful to both the president and the first lady on their what they have done and what they continue to do to raise this issue, keep it front and center on the various programs that occur around the world, and do something about it. And so that's why if we don't, we're up against a huge issue, both from a security standpoint and from a health standpoint. We're also seeing, as you know, in many countries, they perhaps have food and they're moderately food insecure, but they're not. It's not nutritious food, and so it's just food to fill the belly. So nutrition plays a big part in this, especially when we're talking about the growth and health of children.
Thinking is still about the G20 in particular, and the fact that we have this initiative being led by Brazil in particular. In what ways do you see the G20 being a platform for this kind of debate and initiatives that touches on economic issues but are also critical development opportunities? And why is it so important that Brazil is such a significant actor and driving force behind it?
Oh, there's many reasons, but number one, Brazil is a huge country and one that's very involved and very active on the world stage, which is wonderful. But it also, this particular organization, G20, and I don't need to tell you all this, brings together the world's leading economies and the largest agricultural producers in the world. So it's almost a perfect storm of trying to deal with not just the agricultural issues, but the food security issues, and together collectively how we can fix this problem. So it's a great opportunity for all of us who are involved in this in a major way to get together, exchange ideas, brainstorm, be able to pick each other's brains on problems, and also develop science and technology arenas so that we can be more efficient and more effective when we do get into countries where we farm and where agriculture is a large part of what goes on.
You touched on...
May I add also, this is also about our smallholder farmers, and those are primarily women. So making sure that they have the tools, the expertise, the seeds, the ability to get water safely, and be able to farm so that if a woman farms and can feed her family, she will wind up feeding the community. And so that's something that we look to in a major way, is helping our smallholder female farmers have a better way of doing this.
It is such a whole of society approach to an initiative such as this. And you mentioned us having the ability as of right now to be able to feed the population. Mm-hmm. But the world is expected to grow to 10 billion people by 2050, and it will need to adapt to meet rising demand for food and change in dietary patterns. Yeah. International cooperation will be essential to meet this growing and changing demand. And the world, as you mentioned, also faces a challenging geopolitical context in terms of conflict and trade, but also changes to climate, which we also have to adapt to and try to think about as we are pushing for greater productivity. The Atlantic Council is actually coming out with a publication on this in particular, looking at 2050 as a mechanism and a timeline for what we need to do and how we can do so, increase productivity in a way that is not further harming climate. But how can we have this international cooperation actually happen in an effective way? And keeping in mind and thinking about what you mentioned at first, this action-oriented approach and solutions-oriented effort in order for us to achieve this cooperation. How can we do that?
Well, I think number one, if we can continue to elevate the conversation, number one. But number two, the countries that are most affected by this elevate the plight that we're in. It's, in my opinion, because having been around politics a little bit, it's all about framing the issue and making sure that people understand the issue in a clear and coherent way. The problem is, around the world, people don't understand what's going on. Or if they do, well, they're hungry, but they don't know why. Or it's just that's always happens in Africa. We can't help them. That simply isn't true. So in our case, what WFP does, we make sure that we at every one of these organizations that we're there, we have a seat at the table, and making sure that other organizations have a seat at the table, and most importantly, making sure that women have a seat at the table in all of this. So we try very hard to approach this in a broad fashion, and with people like our staff right here who are salted in the audience here a little bit, who are experts in this field, they can take this and they can make sure that we get a clear and concise message through, and that we also give a little boost, a little bit of a kick to countries who perhaps are lagging. And that's our job at WP, and that's the job of UNICEF and WHO and others. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. And if I am able to go deeper into my question, then
Yeah.
is asking about public-private cooperation in the sense of ensuring that we are tackling this issue of hunger and poverty in particular. How can that happen? How can we be more effective in making those cooperations exist and fostering those cooperations to actually happen, not just in countries where they might already happen, but actually in ensuring that this know-how is also sent out to other countries as well?
Well, it's extremely important, as I said, that we cultivate and manage private partnerships because government simply can't do it all. And on top of that, though, part of being the world community is participating in it. We've got a problem, and we need everybody in on this. So it's important that we at WP take this very seriously, and we are cultivating many private partnerships. But there's more to be done, and there's many more organizations and companies, et cetera, that we want involved. We need them involved, not just for monetary reasons, but for their expertise and their scientific aspects. I mean, you know, we've got centers of excellence scattered around the world, including one right here in Brazil. Those kinds of centers is where we bring people in and we bring organizations in so that we can not just talk about our needs, but talk about what they can do. It's a collective discussion and making sure that we have a collective ability to work together. But again, we have to keep raising the issue. This is an issue that gets kicked down every time something else happens in the world, or if there's one country that gets, it's the squeaky wheel that gets all the press coverage, and the rest, are left behind. I don't know if you all know this, but the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet, if it's not mitigated very soon, will be Sudan. Overtakes Gaza by tenfold. And this is huge. This will affect an entire continent. And so, because migration begins from that, because more migration comes from that, it's a cascading effect of many different issues that cause great conflict and great disability within a continent.
In November,
Yeah.
as the G20 leaders meet
Yeah.
in Rio for the Leaders Summit, the world will also be at COP29 and setting the stage for 2025 when Brazil will also host COP30. Food insecurity and hunger have been a key theme in this year's G20, as we've been discussing, but how can we continue these efforts and amplify them to reach the world during COP, but also as a continuation of G20s as they take on South Africa, the US in 2026?
Yeah. Well, number one, if I can talk to COP a little bit, COP, there's wonderful things that take place at COP, and I'm not denigrating COP in any way, shape, or form, but we need to work on the issues that we've been talking about. It needs to produce solutions and produce action items that we can work on. That's not happening. And so that, again, is another frustration of my personal, inability to deal with things that aren't happening quickly. But more importantly, it's important that we as a world make sure that this happens. The leaders of the world are sitting in this room. You're here, you're participating in this. So it's really important that you go out and work on these same issues in your own way, or whatever direction your livelihood or your company goes in this, to make sure that we do keep it elevated. COP's a great way to do this, but again, we've got to stop talking. We have to do. And so you see that certainly WP and other UN agencies in a major way, because we're the ones that are on the front lines. We see it first thing, and we're first in and last out. And so we know not only the implications, but we know the effects that it's having on the planet.
Ms. McCain, you mentioned a few times women and women at the front lines. as we are talking about bringing in these conversations as a continuation of G20, at COP30, at COP29, and many other global convenings, this is an international issue and this is an international
Yeah.
matter. How do we tackle hunger and poverty in an equitable way, bringing in women but also other minorities into this conversation?
You raise a very good point. You know, what we have begun to do in not just our refugee camps, but you know, within our own offices, et cetera, and in the things that we say around the world is we make sure that equity and gender inclusion are first and foremost in all of this. If we don't respect women, how can we expect the rest of the world to respect women and children? So it starts at the top, and you know, in my other life worked on a project that was really fun, and it was about teaching respect, little boys to little girls and little girls to little boys, just teaching respect. Mind you, I realize that's not something that WP does now, but respect is at the core of this whole thing. And so in my opinion, we as a global world have to really keep that issue front and center, because again, they're the first ones to get hit, and they take the brunt of it. A woman will feed her family, but during the course of feeding her family, she will make sure everybody else eats, and she may not get anything, or she may get a much limited amount of things that we can do. Afghanistan is another example of what's occurring in terms of the termination of women's rights in general. So we at WP make sure that we feed women first in Afghanistan, and make sure that that we are servicing them in the best way that we can. Again, it's an issue, and each country is different, and you know, how a country operates and deals with this issue are different, but they need to deal with the issue. Gender equality is extremely important, and also this comes into play. Right now, I'm the PSEA champion for the UN agencies, and what does that mean? I deal with sexual harassment, abuse, all the issues surrounding what women and men do deal with a little bit, and so we're aiming to make WP the best organization in terms of representing what we should and should not be doing within not just our organization, but within our where we feed, where we operate, and in everything we do.
And I think that if I were able to ask you a final question, and I'm
Sure.
going off script here.
No, that's okay.
I just wanted to ask you if we were able to, thinking about 2050, thinking about the opportunity that we have here in Rio with Brazil's G20, with the Global Alliance, with COP in general, what is one takeaway or one important action that needs to be taken for us to be okay by 2050 and not going back all of the steps and having to start over in terms of hunger and poverty?
Well, President Lula has challenged all of us, and he has Brazil itself has put together an incredible program that many countries are now part of. So the action is there, but we have to keep the momentum. I would challenge not just the president, although he doesn't need any challenging. He's really good on this issue. But when November hits, to make sure that, again, this issue is front and center. It's also important, elections have consequences. And we've had, 47% of the globe up for election this year, different around the world. Elections have consequences, and making sure that whatever country you're from, that your candidates are representing this issue and the issues surrounding it with women and other things, representing that in the best way possible. And I'll speak to my own country the same way. I'm hoping that our people can keep this issue elevated and keep it front and center on a presidential race. And I don't know if we can do that, but we're going to try.
With that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for this conversation. Food security and hunger is definitely a priority for the Atlantic Council and will continue to be in the years to come. I appreciate you being here. And with that, I wanted to turn over to the Senior Director of our Geoeconomic Center, Josh Lipsky, for another conversation now focused on the G20 beyond economic crisis. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have seats now. You can come grab a seat. I know folks were waiting. And I want to thank you for joining us for our final session here of the morning and of our public programming today from Rio, from the Atlantic Council. Again, I'm Josh Lipsky, Director of the Geoeconomic Center at the Council. And I am so excited to moderate this panel because it's something we are really animated by at the Geoeconomic Center, which is about what is the role of the G20 beyond crisis. We all understand as a group and have been involved in various ways of when the G20 springs into action. And I said at the beginning, we can think of the global financial crisis, we can think of COVID, but what is the sustainable agenda from presidency to presidency that makes progress on the range of near and medium term challenge the global economy faces, whether it's debt distress, whether it's climate change, and we'll get into all of these issues. So I have an extraordinarily distinguished panel with me today. Sitting to my left, Minister Felipe, he's G20 Sous Sherpa from Brazil. At the far end here, Guillaume Chabert, Deputy Director, SPR, Department Strategy, Policy and Review at the IMF, Tatiana Berenger, Finance Track Coordinator, G20 Social, and Luciana Ribeiro, Leader of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force of the B20. So thank you all for joining me. I know how busy this week is for everyone, running between meetings and sessions and plenaries and communiques, so I appreciate everyone taking the time to be here. And Tatiana, I want to start with you. And I just want to ask from your perspective, how's the week going? Can you give us a status update? I know things aren't done yet. You're in the midst of it. And what are you trying to achieve? What is Brazil trying to achieve from your perspective, your role here at the G20 Social Track?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Luciana, Felipe, Guilherme, and John. So we had been until 2 a.m. at the room negotiating the communique, and we reached out to have one communique. We expected the minister can agree with this in the next days, today and tomorrow. I will summarize that when we have a communique at G20, as you know, we have some reports, some notes, and some consensus based on the priorities of this year. Of course, we didn't finish the G20 Brazilian president, but we reached out some consensus and some achievements. I will list 13 if I can, if I have time for that.
Please.
The first one were the launch of Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty yesterday, and the finance pillar, that the finance track has been leading it. The second one was a note entitled A Manual of Policy Measures and the Recommendations to Address Inequality Pressures. It came from Framework Working Group. The third is the G20 Sustainable Finance Report and receiving the independent high-level experts group review on the vertical climate and environmental funds. The fourth, Sustainable Finance Working Group agenda focus on advancing robust, credible, and just transition plans for finance institutions and corporates. The fifth G20 OCDE report on approaches for finance and investment in climate-resilient infrastructure. And I think we have made an element with the B20 on that. The 60 is the progress made on debt treatment under the G20 Common Framework and beyond. It welcomed joint efforts by stakeholders to continue working towards enhancing debt transparency and encourage private creditors to follow. G20 note on the lessons learned from the first case under the Common Framework. The eighth is the African-led debate on debt and development financing. It was convened by Brazilian G20 presidents in June, and what was a high-level debate was held by African representatives to the G20 delegations and the Africa exports. The ninth, the urgent and importance of realignment in quota shares to better reflect the members' relative positions in the world economy while protecting the quota shares of the poorest members. the tense was they welcomed the decision to create the 24 chair of IMF Executive Board to enhance the voice and the representation of sub-Saharan Africa, and the ongoing work of IFA Working Group to survey practices on regional and female representation across international finance institutions. 11, we welcome the progress made on two-pillar solutions under the OECD G20. And 12, we continue to work towards a fair, more stable and efficient international tax system for the first 1 century, and the support for UN Convention. And last but not least, the improvement of global civil society participation. As you know, we had the first session with the engagement groups at the finance track and Sherpas track these years, and we hope it could be a legacy for the next presidents, South Africa and the US. That's it.
Thank you. I appreciate and such an ambitious and important agenda. I want to come back on the tax point and check in on that specifically and how it's going, because I know there were a lot of proposals out there. But Felipe, that's actually a very good transition too, because this was brought up before in the earlier session, this idea of integrating more the Sherpa track and the finance track. So your perspective on that from the Sherpa side, and then the question to you, how are the goals of the Brazilian G20 presidency going so far? What do you want to achieve this week, and what do you need to do between now and November?
Thank you very much, Josh. First, let me thank you, the Atlantic Council, for this invitation to be part in this distinguished panel here to talk about my one and only issue, Brazilian presidency of G20. It's the only issue I'm talking. No, thank you. No, it's good because yesterday we had the adoption of the basic documents of the Global Alliance, so it was very well received, I would say. President Lula made chaired the meeting, and now we have the basic documents that adopted. So the idea is to have this now participants of the alliance to come together and to be in a position to really announce the results by November. If you allow me, Josh, I want to highlight, I think Renata, pointed very well, the first sort of aspect that we are very proud of this exercise is to try to bring the two tracks together. There is no way in talking Sherpas, talking about policy issues, and then finance guys going into the other direction. We have to come together if we want to produce something. So this is the first sort of achievement. The second one, Felipe in the last panel mentioned, I think it's also very good, very important that we managed to focus this joint exercise on the issue of food and poverty and hunger, because this is a long-deserved issue that really we have lots of work to do. But there is a third aspect that I think it's also very important to highlight, is the sort of how we incorporated the finance dimension of the Global Alliance into the equation. Because it would be easy just to create another fund. Oh, here comes Brazil with another fund, and then donors saying, okay, how much do you want us to put forward? And actually, the Global Alliance is not about a new fund. And I think here is something that was calling everyone's attention. The idea was we have on the one side the policy baskets. You want to finance policies that have been tested. So it's not something coming out of the blue, good ideas. You were working with policies that have been tested on the ground in order to produce results regarding ODS 1 and 2. So this is the first part of it. And then you need, of course, finance to do this. How are you going to finance this? And actually what we are proposing, what we're bringing to the table, is a sort of a menu of options. So it would allow different donors to come. So if you do not have fresh money to put on the table, no worries. There is an option there for you to join. International organizations. There is no need to create a new fund. So if you have money, if you have a portfolio, put 5% of your portfolio, say, no, this 5%, this amount here is to finance policies aimed at attacking ODS 1 and 2 issues. So there is no need to reinvent the wheel. You have to ensure that actually what is there actually arrives at the end of the day. So you have China. Okay, you don't like the idea of debt swap as a policy, whatever. But in this case, in this country, is debt swap something possible? maybe we can solve the issue here. There is no need for you to agree as a principle, but if in this case you can come with a debt swap solution, maybe we can address the problem here. Now, you are a country, then you have lots of money. No, I have lots of money, I want to put fresh money. Okay, it's also possible. There is no need also to put in a new fund. Use an existing fund of an international organization and put it as an earmarked fund. You say, okay, I'm donating 10,000, I don't know how much you want to put forward, and you say, this money is to finance those policies that are on that basket, saying the policies to ODS 1 and 2. And finally, you have the knowledge pillar, is the one that ensures that you have the match and you know how to do it. Because you need agencies, you need people that know how to implement those kind of programs. It cannot be theoretical solutions. You have to be on the ground and you know how to address. So in a nutshell, I would like to really highlight this sort of it's not an innovation, but a sort of a creative approach that we're bringing to the table in what regards the financing of the Global Alliance. So it's not just another fund competing, with money.
And the question we'll get to when I go through the second round is how we make that sustainable through South Africa's G20 presidency, because this is often something we see where the G20 presidencies come in with ambitious and creative solutions, but it's not always followed through in the next one. But we can talk about that, and because I do think this is an important innovation, what you talked about in the Sherpa Finance track and some of these going forward and not reinventing the wheel. Now, Guillaume, I want to turn to you because debt was raised and finance was raised, so obviously I have to go to the IMF on this issue now. One thing I full disclosure, I used to work at the IMF, so one thing always surprised me when I started at the IMF was how deeply involved the IMF is with the G20. I didn't understand that before I started at the fund. And I'd like to hear from you, your perspective, how IMF engagement is going with Brazil's G20 presidency, but then that's specific to this week and going forward through the Leaders Summit. But stepping back a little, how the IMF engages with the G20 process overall.
Sure, thanks, Joss, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Congratulations to Brazil for the very successful yesterday's launch, or not launch, but agreement on the basic principle of the Global Alliance, very important topic, of course. Let me illustrate what we think is very important in the G20 work with using what is being done this week and why it matters for the IMF at every G20 meeting and how we are involved, let's say. The first thing is at all meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, one important thing that people tend to forget, which is super important, is a collective assessment of the state of the global economy. Where are we? And what are the policy response to address current challenges, right? It's bread and butter for the G20. And it's bread and butter for the IMF too, and the link. So on this point, we see a growing consensus, a broad consensus, that the likelihood of a soft landing is increasing, which is good news. That said, multiple challenges remain. Inflation has come down from elevated level, but this inflation path is not ended. Fiscal situation in many countries is very constrained. You mentioned that, but in all countries, actually, fiscal space is quite constrained. And I'll come back to that. And then in terms of growth, typically our projection for growth prospect in 2024 is 3.2%, 3.3% in 2025. 5 years from now, it will be 3.1%, so it's 3-ish, if you so wish. But it's significantly below the 3.8% we had on average in the 2 decades pre-COVID. So those issues are typically issues that finance ministers, central bank governors need to discuss. And it leads me to my second point. We are very, very happy, very grateful, in fact, to Brazil to have put inequality and taxation very high in the agenda. Let me explain why. I mentioned the fiscal situation in many countries. Fiscal space is super constrained in all countries. You have huge development needs. You have huge social discontent and social demand, and rightly so. So if you don't take enough attention, if you don't pay enough attention on how you will do the fiscal consolidation which is needed, and fiscal consolidation is not rocket science. It's raising taxes, it's cutting spending, right? But the way you do that, if you don't do that with a sense of fairness on the burden sharing, right? On how you raise taxes through progressive taxation, or if you cut spending, how do you protect social protection to protect the social fabric Well, then you go to riots, to disaster, to discontent, as we have seen in many countries. So this link between taxation inequality is super important. And coming to your question, Josh, at some point, we are contributing to this work through analytics, through policy options for consideration by ministers and governors. Typically, we have produced for this week meeting a note on the impact of growth on inequality and social outcomes. We, based on experience, have evidence that long period of weak growth actually increase inequality much more than sharp recession followed by recovery. So how to address that? And we have also seen that countries would pay attention on how to protect the workers, poorest households, etc., have better outcomes in terms of reducing this inequality in period of prolonged growth, weak growth. So that's one of our input and how ministers and central governments can indeed have a menu of options on how to address those issues. Second aspect, we have produced a note on options to raise revenues. For advanced economies, emerging markets, low-income countries, and another note jointly with the bank on how to do that specifically in the context of low-income countries, right? So again, it's policy consideration, and the third aspect, and then I'll stop, is all of the work that the Brazilian presidency has, given on MDB reform, making MDB better, bigger, more effective. It was launched by the Indian presidency last year, but Brazil has continued this work. So that's one aspect of you can have a long-term agenda even with rotating G20 presidencies. That's super important. We may come back to development finance, but that's super important and very important for us too. So we are very much involved, happy to contribute, and very, very supportive of the outcome of this week.
Well, Guillaume, thank you. And I think that's such a perfect example of the Indian presidency raising the profile of the Brazilian presidency, continuing it. And I think we've already talked to some in South Africa where we know this is key to them. So that is a great example of where you can have continuity. And then there's the role, as you said, the IMF plays of just level setting. Where are we in the global economy? Where are we? And this helps set, from a central bank governor perspective, from a finance minister perspective, credible data that we have to make these decisions based off of. Luciana, I want to turn to you. We've been talking from the public sector perspective. We spoke in the morning about how this is the 80th anniversary this week of the end of the Bretton Woods conference. The global economy has changed enormously in 80 years. One of the ways it has changed is the role the private sector plays. And the G20 recognizes that, I think, through the B20 process, which you play a key role in here in Brazil. And I'm wondering how the B20 engages in the G20 process overall, and more broadly, the role of the private sector in making these decisions and facilitating these decisions when we think of green transition, climate finance, for example. We're talking about policies from the public sector, but it's the private sector that is going to make or break this at the end of the day.
Couldn't agree more. And thank you very much for inviting me. And a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished group. Felipe was mentioning, I like very much, the fact that this G20 has been an integration, right? When I was kindly invited to chair the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force for the B20, and I started to form the group that was going to produce the recommendations, the number one comment I received throughout the globe was, is my time worth? Because at the end of the day, the B20 is not being heard. We don't see this connection between the B20 and the G20. And I'm happy to tell you that once I have accepted, I have formed a group. Now, the same group that was in doubt about how worth it would be to be part of it is completely on the opposite side. Because I think that for the first time, there was a huge openness from the G20 to work together and to hear each other. We have been very close to the finance track, to Sherpa Tatiana Rosito and her entire team. And we have been exchanging views. Because as you said, when we look, and let me focus here on climate, that's basically what we have been discussing, okay? When we look into the amount of money that is going to be needed to do the transition, trillions of dollars, more than 2/3 of that money is coming out of the private sector. We need the private sector to be engaged. And besides integration, what I think it was very important during this presidency was to change the narrative from merely speaking of climate financing to understand this as a climate investment as an opportunity because the narrative is different. The world is changing, the sources of energy are changing, and the business opportunities are there. I'm not saying that everything that's on climate is an opportunity, a business opportunity, but I'm saying that there is a huge chunk that is really what the private sector can and is already doing. That's an important point. Of course, we face challenges, especially when we are talking about developing and least developed countries, right? Because we have country risk, we have exchange rate risk. Those risks are a reality, and we need to address them. So part of our task force was also to discuss how can we not only enlarge the budgets of the DFIs and MDBs, but how to use better the money that's already there. Because let me tell you something that's very important. We have to mobilize private capital, and we have to increase every dollar that you use from the public sector, how many dollars you want to move on the private sector. We have, if you take the experiences that we have throughout the world, you can invest $1 from the public sector and half from the private sector, sometimes zero. But you have also experience where you put $1 from the public sector and you turn out to have $5 of the private sector. How can you take those interesting experiences that were really able to increase the amount of private capital and replicate that and scale that? And so, and just last comment here on the same topic, for the private sector to come in, besides country risk, exchange risk, there's another element that's very relevant, that's how predictable the sector is. That talks with public policies. We need to know what's the scenario that each one of the countries have. We have to have standardization. If for every sector, every country have different rules and different ways of investing is complicated. And last but not least, when we are talking about infrastructure, it's very relevant for a private investor to understand how long it's going to take. Because sometimes it doesn't matter if you are talking about developing economies or developed economies. Sometimes you go into the US, and for you to do an investment in infrastructure, it can take 10, 12 years to be approved. A private investor cannot wait for 12 years to have some investment approved, you know. We need to standardize, we need to make it faster, the way to approve infrastructure investments through resilience and through adaptation and through new economic models. So I'm very confident here today because I think that the tracks are much more aligned. And I think that we know, Minister Marina da Silva yesterday mentioned, we know what we need to do. We know, everybody knows, technically speaking, we know what we need to do. We need right now to center our energy and our resources to scale the solutions that are already there. And honestly, I think that we are in the right track here.
That was such a really refreshingly optimistic take. We do a lot of work around the G20, and I don't know if I've ever heard such a positive response from the B20 about their engagement in the G20. So credit to Brazil's presidency for doing this the way I think it's designed and intended to do. Tatiana, I want to turn back to you. Can you take us inside the room a little bit? And I want to drill down specifically on development finance. This is something we always talk about. Obviously, we're in an IDA replenishment cycle now going on. But basically, what often happens is going into these meetings, the ministers and the leaders and the heads of the MDBs are talking about the need for more resources, the need for more development finance. But then you get in the room and we talk fiscal constraints and we talk budgets, and 50% of the world's facing elections this year, domestic pressures. The tensions you're seeing between the rhetoric and the reality, I really appreciate your perspective on that.
Okay.
Easy questions. So.
Easy question. I think they all agree that the world is facing a polycrisis momentum, and we need more resources to fight against poverty and to fight against climate change. No, there is no disagreement about it. And in terms of multilateral sources, if we can say, I think three points were achieved during these debates and during the working groups activities in the last months. The first one was the SDR rechanneling. It was a debate about it, and I think now we can have IMF this instrument with up to $140 billion for climate and fighting poverty. This can be used for multilateral development banks. It means that at least $4 for everyone can be reconducted for the multilateral development banks. So it can be a big opportunity to the enforcement of MDBs and to the use of SDR in this moment. The second one was the IDA 21 replenishment. Yesterday we were co-sponsor for a meeting with global civil society here in Rio de Janeiro with the World Bank and the IDA team. They made something like a constant for civil society, and the idea is how to canalize the IDA for the global alliance against hunger and poverty. So it could be a good opportunity. As Felipe mentioned, it's not a new source, but how you use this source and have this alliance between the World Bank resource and the Brazilian initiative for fighting against global and alliance. And it's good to highlight that for Brazil, it's something that we really support as a tradition for our foreign policy, that is South-South cooperation. We are looking to have it, or triangle cooperation. It means that we can have South-South and South-North cooperation working together to this fight, as all the world are fighting against hunger. It means we have a South inside the North that we need to face it. So it's very important. And the third one was the MDB's roadmap to make the bigger, better, and more effective. It was one of the big priorities of Brazilian presidents, and I think we are, really going through a good achievement on that we can have now international finance institutions going through a better way to work towards this crisis and this international community agreement. So I think and the last one was the international taxation agenda that I can develop if I have more time. But I think if you have these four sources, the Brazilian proposal for tax the super rich can deliver 3 times more than what the multilateral development banks has today for fighting against hunger and poverty. So the idea that Gabriel Zucman proposed, that Minister Fernanda give us a mandate and a green card to go and spread this word, and let's do this, let's tax the super rich, and let's fight against the tax evasion. So we are really looking for how the international commerce and the international digitalization nowadays put some challenge to give the real revenues that the states needs to enforce their public policies and make some common goals with the citizens. So I think this fourth, we could say that we are going to a new momentum.
Well, let me just ask you on the fourth one, because I know the proposal was made, I think it was at the IMF spring meetings, IMF World Bank spring meetings, and it has been met. I think Secretary Yellen has been public about this with skepticism, at least from the US. So how are you seeing this? Obviously, there's agreement on need for more inclusive taxation, reform of taxation more broadly. U.S. has certainly done a lot on that, but on the super wealthy tax, the billionaires tax in particular, it seems from our perspective, from the U.S. perspective, there's skepticism. Is that how you're reading it?
Yes, we can say that we get a consensus on that. We in this afternoon expected to have this as an agreement. We cannot affirm at this moment, but I think we have on the table good declaration with the aspects that go push forward this agenda. But we know that it will not be completed until November. We still have many work to do towards OECD and towards the UN Convention and so on. But I think everyone has now something that we can say that tax the super rich is something fair. Let's make it happen.
Okay, we will look forward to that announcement and keep a close eye on it.
But we need few times to celebrate or not.
Guillaume, let me turn to you on the SDR rechanneling that Tatiana brought up, because this has been talked about now for several years, really since the pandemic, when I think this, the new issuance of SDRs and then the rechanneling. But is there actual progress now on the rechanneling? There's been some complaints from countries that it hasn't happened fast enough. Is there movement here, and how will that actually work in process?
So, yeah, I think it was a difficult issue from a technical standpoint because SDRs are reserve assets, right? So those countries holding SDRs, they want to keep the reserve asset nature of their holdings, right? So technically, it's not easy. Just to mention that we have already channeled more than 100 billion of those SDRs since the pandemic through the instrument at the IMF, so the PRGT, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is our concessional arm. And if I may, I would also say something on the development finance aspect of things, but also this resiliency and sustainability trust, the RST, that we created precisely to facilitate the rechanneling of SDRs. So more than 100 billion have been rechanneled through that way. And indeed, in May, our executive board approved the use of SDRs for the acquisition of hybrid capital instruments that will be issued by those MDBs which are what we call prescribed holders, right? Those are MDBs which are entitled to hold SDRs. So we have a dozen of them. And now it's really for the MDBs and for the countries to see whether there is appetite to use this channel. But the instrument is in place for this channeling to indeed see light. And we are very supportive of this agenda, right? Because typically, even the RST to some extent, for those who know, the RST that we have at the fund, we created it to support the effort of countries in tackling climate change or the impact of climate change, and also pandemic preparedness. And we are not experts in those fields, right? So we have to work very closely, in particular with the World Bank and other MDBs, World Health Organization on pandemic preparedness. It's not necessarily the optimal way of doing things, right? So MDBs have a strong role there. If you allow me 1 minute, perhaps, on the development finance agenda, we are not a development finance institution, right? But our role is really to help bring some macroeconomic and financial stability, which are the precondition for development, right? If you have high inflation, you will never have stability. Those who lose the most from inflation are the poorest, we know that. If you have public finances which are in total disorder, if you have your external accounts which are in disorder, it's not sustainable, right? So we are providing the precondition, in a sense, for facilitating development and development agenda. And of course, we are working very closely, in particular with the World Bank. We are two sister institutions, and it goes hand in hand. The reason why I mentioned that is that we are precisely this year working very closely on the IDA 21 replenishment. And on our side, we are reviewing our concessional arm, this PRGT, which has been used extremely intensively in COVID time and then in 2022 with the spillovers of the war in Ukraine. So we had to lend 5 times the capacity of these instruments for a few years, and the resources are completely depleted, right? So we have to restore a lending capacity which has to be higher than it used to be because the world is more prone shock, and we need resources for that. And we have agreed that we will not call on countries to bring us some grants. If there is fiscal space in countries, it has to go to IDA. We want a very strong IDA. And we want to use the internal resources of the IMF, if the membership agrees, to indeed provide a self-sustainable lending envelope, which would be roughly 3 times what it used to be pre-COVID. So it's really intense. And last thing is we are all preparing, of course, the 4th conference on financing for development next year, working hand in hand with partners. We are a member of the inter-agency task force on development finance. We contributed to the financing for sustainable development report every year, including the last one, which will be the stock-taking exercise as an input for the FFD4. And you mentioned that, you mentioned all of those issues. We are very much involved in that process. And again, it's a collective effort. And we are very happy and, again, very grateful for Brazil to have put that on the agenda. We expect South Africa, of course, to continue that work. So that's also another example of continuity, even if presidency rotates.
That's a key one, and one we're going to work on at the Atlantic Council, and we've been doing research around this area. I asked Tatiana a tough question. I'm going to come to Philippe with a tough question now on geopolitics. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you had a G20 member at war with a non-G20 member, Ukraine, but conflicted against several G20 members, including the US and Europe, basically opposing the invasion. Since that time, geopolitics has really, in many ways, come in from the background into the foreground of G20 processes. We know this from our work with the G20, be it finance ministers, foreign ministers, leader summits, difficulty on reaching communiques, going back to Indonesia's presidency and then India's presidency. How is Brazil navigating this challenge? Because I think Brazil has taken an approach, at least from my perspective, that's been different from some of the previous G20 presidencies in recent years.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, the geopolitical issue became, since Indonesia, since the war in Ukraine, the issue of G20. Because actually, geopolitical questions were blocking all ministerial declaration. It was impossible to get to substance because there was the geopolitical issue preventing us to agree on anything. So we managed to have the leaders' declaration in Indonesia and New Delhi last year, but actually it was a huge effort. But G20 is not only about it's about the leaders, of course, but you have all the working groups, the ministerial declaration, and this was completely no way to find a solution. So, and then if you lose the consensus in G20, this is a real blow to G20, because the strength of G20 is consensus. Because if you start footnoting everything that you disagree, well, there is no point in having G20, because of course we have different views. So you need to give a unified voice on all topics, and geopolitical questions were preventing us to deliver this. And I'm very happy to say that early this month, Sherpas managed to find a solution, an agreeable solution, to how to handle the geopolitical crisis, because now on the top of the Ukraine issue, we have Gaza, we have others, so it's adding insult to injury, going down the road. And the solution that we managed to find, well, first, it's applicable in principle for the 2 tracks, for all working groups, so it's a horizontal solution, is to have a statement by the presidency, it's a document by the presidency, recognizing the issue, saying, well, we have geopolitical issues and we have different views on this issue. And actually, this presidency declaration would depict what is the problem. And taking this from ministerial declaration, then you have the possibility of discussing substance and agreeing on substance. And actually, this solution was, this week, proven to be a good one, because we managed to have the ministerial declaration of the working group on development. So it was a consensus ministerial declaration. And yesterday was the documents of the Global Alliance. Again, consensual documents, we have everything approved. And you have the side document by the presidency. So, and we hope now the employment working group is starting today in Fortaleza. And we also expect to have a ministerial declaration there as well. So it's a little bit G20 back on track in producing, substantive outcomes.
I think that's an elegant solution, and I appreciate what you said about the strength of the G20 is in consensus, but we also can't ignore the geopolitics at the same time. And we started this day talking about the creation of the IMF and the World Bank at the Bretton Woods conference, which we always remind people when we talk about it, happened not after World War II, but during World War II, 6 weeks after D-Day. So the intersection of economics, finance, and foreign policy is not new. It has just come back to the forefront in a way, and we all have to navigate those challenges together. Lucia, I want to turn to you on the geopolitics, because it's business so much that is actually on the front lines of the geopolitics. And I'm thinking from a US perspective of Western sanctions, G7 sanctions, things that have happened so much that have affected the global economy, especially in the past few years, and how business and the private sector are navigating those headwinds.
Thank you, Josh. I remember I was at COP28 at an Atlantic Council event, by the way, about the energy transition. And one of the panelists said, don't be mistaken. There is besides everything, when we are talking about climate, there is a commercial war. And that's a fact, at the end of the day, once you understand that the sources of energy are changing, and whoever owns the production of energy and the value chain will have more power, and that's completely linked to climate and businesses, you have an issue, right? So being very transparent with you, when I accepted the role of chair of this task force, I was concerned about it, okay? But what I saw we were able to reach consensus, and we have a large group, well represented by different countries from the G20. And what for me was a big surprise is that at the end of the day, when we are talking about the three main problems that we were addressing at our task force, the views were very similar. So when we were talking about mobilizing private capital, it's kind of a common view throughout the globe that we need to do that. When we are talking about how to cite some countries that have been able to invest and deploy infrastructure very quickly, pretty much the entire globe is having the same issue of how to authorize infrastructure that is related to climate in a faster way. So it's kind of a consensus. And third topic that I have not mentioned at the beginning, but I think that's very relevant, is how you're going to prepare the entire value chain, especially when we are talking about small and medium businesses. We don't talk that much about the small and medium businesses, and in Brazil particularly, when we are talking about agriculture, we are not even talking about businesses. Those are people that are running farms, small farms, of course. How we are going to involve those small and medium businesses in this new and changing business environment? How we are not going to let them behind? And especially on developing economies, small and medium business represent sometimes more than half of the jobs created on those countries. So at the end of the day, I think that because of the areas that we have chosen to recommend upon, there was a consensus from different business leaders from all geographies that we need to foster those areas. Having said that, let's not be naive. There is a commercial war besides the geopolitical discussions, and we need to be aware of that.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point. It gets lost in the high level of the geopolitics, but this is where it is happening. This is where businesses are feeling it, and therefore that's where people are feeling it, and that's where jobs are being affected on the day-to-day.
And sometimes, every regulation that you have in different countries change the entire value chain. From the IRA in the US, I'll give you a very precise example, that's very good for climate, lots of money being thrown in the US. We don't know what's going to happen now with the elections, but it was a game changer for many countries, because at the end of the day, some projects that were very interesting economically speaking in other places became less interesting. So there is a lot of discussions here, and we need to face that.
I appreciate that. Guillaume, I have one question for you, and then we're almost out of time, so I'm going to then turn to my Brazilian colleagues for a forward-looking question. But Guillaume, to the IMF, I want to talk about the common framework, because this has been obviously something talked about over the last few years. Ideally, a new arrangement to bring China into the debt relief conversation, but has not produced as many results as people had hoped. What do you see as the future of the framework? Is there progress being made here? And I know that SPR and others at the IMF are coming forward with sort of complementary plans on debt relief right now, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
So trying to be brief on something which would deserve seminars. First of all, yes, expectations were super high at the time of the adoption of the common framework in November 2020. Disclaimer, I was in the negotiation at that time on the French side, and it was basically a negotiation between the Paris Club and China under the G20 auspices, so we can talk about it. I think the expectation may have been too high at that time, that the breakthrough, which is bringing China and other non-Paris Club creators like Saudi Arabia, like India, at the same table at the Paris Club to deliver joint debt relief, which is a clear breakthrough, would take a bit of time to come to the agreement on the detailed technical aspects of what is needed to do a deep debt restructuring. For instance, what is the debt parameter you involve? Do you include domestic debt or don't you include domestic debt? What is the role of MDBs in contributing to the solution? There are thousands of things where you need a bit of time to come to an agreement. Now, countries which defaulted at that time, they didn't have that time in front of them, right? So Zambia, Chad, etc., experienced a very dire situation in 21, 22. I think we have gone past that aspect nowadays, right? Through this work at the Creator Committee, with the support of the creators involved, but also IMF, World Bank, we played a strong role. I think we also created this global sovereign debt roundtable to help everyone come to some common understanding on those technicalities that have helped quite a lot. Timelines have been divided by two, basically. The last example, which is Ghana, we are mainly essentially on track with the traditional timeline for such restructuring. So it's not as bad as it seems, but it takes time for people to realize that. You know that Ethiopia is in the making. We may have good news on that front. So it's and more in line with what was the objective. Now, the situation in our view is we have shifted a bit from what we thought in 2020, where we were all afraid that we were faced with a systemic debt crisis. We have avoided a systemic debt crisis so far. Now, there are huge liquidity pressures. Many countries don't have the fiscal space to spend enough on education, health, investment, on infrastructure, etc. That will in turn have an impact on growth and job creation, which is bad, which could also turn into what is currently a liquidity challenge into a solvency crisis. So we are trying to convince everyone that what is really needed and urgently and badly needed is a package of action to create fiscal space through domestic resources mobilization, structural reform to enhance growth. The development finance issue is super important. They need more concessional finance, if only to bridge the gap between those reforms decided now and when those reforms will yield results. And there may be some situations where replacing costly debt by less costly debt through liquidity management operation, maybe using a bit of MDB money to provide some credit enhancement for incentivizing new inflows from the private sector. There are many things which could be done, which are completely different from a debt restructuring per se. So I stop here, but we think there is a momentum to work on these liquidity challenges now.
That's very helpful, because I think there's, at least in Washington, a lot of conversation of, is this the end of the common framework? Do we need something new? And I see something very different from what you're saying, that it can work, it's making progress.
It's working.
Okay, that's a helpful message. So final question to the three other panelists here. And Philippe, I'm going to start with you. South Africa hosts G20 presidency next year. After that, every G20 member will have hosted once, and then the G20 will come back to the United States in 2026. What advice would you give to the United States as they plan their G20 presidency? Philippe, I'll start with you.
Well, depend on what United States are you talking about. It depends on what you need to have. So I would have a couple of different
you can give two answers.
So I'm going to a sort of a more safe sort of suggestion. I would say that actually what we need in G20 is to ensure that G20 is not becoming something too heavy for the presidency to take over. Because what the issue with, there is no secretariat, there is no agreement, there is nothing. It's for the country that is doing the presidency to bring everything forward. And honestly, I think that G20 is becoming more and more a bureaucracy in itself to handle. So that's why, and that's a question that sometimes people forget to ask, why did we create two task forces and one initiative and not a working group? Because a working group lasts forever, and once you create a working group, you can't get rid of it. So the idea of a task force is to say, okay, this is for our presidency. In principle, it should end by the end of the year. So we are not adding to more and more infrastructure. And the counterexample is a very good one. in 2020, Saudi Arabia created the working group on tourism. At that juncture, it made sense because how governments can do public policies in tourism in time of a pandemic? A good question. Well, but it's over, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the working group is still there. And actually you don't know what to do and you try to invent issues to put into the working group. And to be honest, G20 is not a think tank. G20 is, you put together political sort of momentum to make an issue to move forward. Once it's done, okay, it's not for us anymore. So that's why I would suggest for South Africa, this already last week I was in South Africa, that was my humble piece of advice, don't add to the complexities. Let's try to make it efficient, reduce, focus, you put an issue to move forward and then step back. So not creating permanent sort of ongoing discussions forever.
So just one quick follow-up on that. You don't think there should be a secretariat? Is it too much of a burden for the presidency country, just from your perspective, from the Sherpa?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of G20. If you start putting a secretariat, well, it's another organization, and actually say, well, that's not exactly the value added of G20. G20 is to put the 20 leaders to move an agenda forward. Yeah. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the value added. Otherwise, it's just another one. And the problem with G20, if you go down this road, it's going to overlap with existing sort of organization. Then, okay, are we redoing things? Are we trying to be a substitute for, the United Nations is not working. Okay, let's create G20 because then issues are going to move in G20. No, it's wrong. We're not going very far if we take this approach. So the beauty of the G20 is it's to be this sort of nimble organization that you can go run, hit and run, you solve this issue, you go there and you adapt every year. So
that's helpful, and your perspective is very valuable, being in the thick of it right now. Luciana, to you, it seems to me, having done several G20s now, the B20 basically just gets reconstituted each year based on the private sector in the country that is hosting it that year. Is there some way to form continuity between B20s, and how should the US think about that challenge?
I think that there are two things. First, there is continuity, because at the end of the day, if you take people that have been there, it has been many of the same people over and over. But the two consensus are the following. First, we need more integration between the private and the public sector. For the discussions not to be bureaucratic, we need to understand what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't help to have discussions that don't involve the big players and the relevant players from the private sector. So we need more integration. The second thing is, even though I think that we have advanced a lot, we need to be more pragmatic. Let me give you one example. The DFI's MDB discussion has been going on, you guys know because you have been in this discussion for more time than I have, for 10 years, 15 years. Is there any recommendation that is new? Not really, So we know the problems, we know the solutions, let's act,
I think that's an interesting point, because one benefit of the G20, it's not fully multilateral, it's not 189 members, is the ability to act, but with all the constraints on action with the divergent views and the geopolitics we discussed. So it's not easy, but if anyone can act and actually make movement representing 85% of global GDP, it's the G20. Tatiana, final word to you, the advice you'd have for the US as they start thinking about their presidency in 2026.
I would agree with Felipe. We don't know which US we will have in 2026 or in the end of the Brazilian presidents, but I think that a good president, even from the US or for South Africa, is that they need to be aligned with the real and the concrete problems that the world faces in this moment. I think it's not more possible to live with the increase of such inequalities, of the disasters, the climate disasters, and so it's important even from US to look to what the world is facing and how they can fight against it. All these things are making or strengthening the extreme right in the world. So the transversality, I think, as Philippe mentioned, is not to create more working groups or work streams, but to see how the transversality of these issues can bring better solutions. So not just the two tracks that need to work together, but how the solutions are made when we really, really think that economy, political, and social issues are integrated and they need to face it. And that's really important to listen who is impacted and who suffer with all this crisis. So social participation is really, really important to have agreements and solutions that will really affect the people in the world. So I think it's important.
I think that's the perfect note to end on, and congratulations to Brazil's already successful G20 presidency, and we look forward to continuing to support in any way we can at the Atlantic Council. Guillaume, Tatiana, Luciana, Philippe, thank you. Please join me in thanking our fantastic guests. As they exit, my colleague Mugan Kusari will deliver closing remarks about our research and programming going forward, and then we will break for lunch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, and good afternoon. I'm Rugang Busari, Assistant Director with the Geoeconomics Center, and thank you all for joining us today, here in Rio in person, as well as those of you who have joined us online. Before we leave, I want to thank all of our partners as well as the staff that have made this conference reality, and that includes Iveta Kruma and Graham McGillivray, as well as our teams in Washington, D.C. As we have discussed today, the G20 and the Bretton Woods system are facing important challenges and must decide on the way forward to adapt to a rapidly changing global economy. The Geoeconomics Center's Bretton Woods 2.0 project aims to provide research and analysis that will facilitate policymakers to do just that, to develop a new framework that will revitalize the international financial system. New frameworks need new ideas. And that is why the Atlantic Council launched the Bretton Woods Fellowship last year. This fellowship aims to cultivate a new generation of young economists to rethink the pillars of global governance and capitalism. Over the course of 9 months, these mid-career fellows partner with undergraduate students to propose new ways to address new problems, from developing a blueprint for central bank digital currencies to mitigating the effects of geoeconomic fragmentation on net zero targets. We don't only develop these ideas, we help the G20 put it into action as well through our participation with the T20. But we also recognize the difficulties in making these plans a reality. Geopolitical tensions between the world's largest economies have heightened in the last few years. The resulting geoeconomic fragmentation is threatening global economic growth. And even reaching consensus on simple, sometimes key decisions at the G20 has become difficult. The G20 can use this moment to show that it is more than the sum of its parts, that it remains an effective platform for international coordination beyond crisis. Given the scale of the challenges that we have discussed today, the priorities set forth by Brazil won't be achieved in 1 year. Continuity and following up on the agenda will determine the success of the G20 going forward. If South Africa and the United States, the two next presidents of the G20, can build on the progress made by Indonesia, India, and Brazil, then the G20 will remain at the heart of international economic coordination. We will do everything we can to support that effort. Thank you all for joining us, and we wish you a pleasant rest of the day.